What is up, night crawlers? Welcome back to the Nightmare's Edge, and thank you all so much for being here. Tonight, we start an epic 11-part 4-video journey. The story is, there's an ancient tower in the middle of the North Atlantic by FishermanTales. This is a fantastic journey. Please check the description for the link to the story and his page. Now you may be asking yourself, how do you make an epic tale even more epic? Well, with epic voices. Tonight, I have the amazing talents of RomNex, As the Raven Dreams, and SomberPuppet. If you're unaware of who any of these people are, check the description for links to their YouTube channels and socials. Now, without any further ado, sit back, relax, and let me tickle those inner fears. Some time ago, we set sail from Fort Lauderdale. Our destination was Lagos, Portugal. The estimated trip was about 3 to 4 weeks, assuming everything went smoothly. My wife Hannah and I had spent several months before the trip learning how to sail. We had the time and money to pack up and go, and we'd always wanted to see Lagos. So we decided it was time to put our new skill and sailboat to good use. The first week was exciting. A sense of freedom comes with sailing the open seas, which is funny considering we spent most of our time confined to a 30-foot space. But as we looked out into the endless waters, we couldn't help but feel we had left the world behind and entered a new one. Like we'd left all our expectations and worries in a separate reality. Despite the feeling of liberation, there were still a few bumps in the first week. The wind wasn't as much of a team player as we had hoped, and the water got a little rough at times, but we managed. By the second week, we were sailing in the middle of the North Atlantic, roughly halfway between Fort Lauderdale and Lagos. That first morning of the new week, I'd gotten out of bed before sunrise, made a cup of coffee, and climbed above deck. That was my morning routine. The water was flat, and there wasn't any wind. It was foggy out. As we floated forward a bit, the sun began to rise. I could see a dark object sticking out of the water. I thought it was a capsized boat. It was somewhat rounded like the underside of a hull. I woke up Hannah and told her to grab some vests and the first aid kit. But as we got closer, I could see that it wasn't a sailboat. It was a mass of rock. Hannah appeared on deck with the rescue gear in hand, a puzzled look on her face as she asked,
"Wait, there are people on that rock?"
"I thought it was a boat." I was as confused as her. Why was there a rock in the middle of the ocean? It's supposed to be thousands of feet deep right here. I steered the ship alongside it and shut off the motor. The rock didn't stick out of the water much. I was able to jump from the sailboat onto its surface without issue, but the surface area was huge, over 5 times that of the boat.
"You think it's some sort of underwater mountain?"
Hannah asked from the boat. I walked along the surface. "Maybe we should go under and look."
I'll grab the goggles.
Hannah hurried below deck. She loved the water. We both did. Any reason to throw goggles on and explore. She was game. She appeared back on deck wearing goggles, a snorkel, and a wetsuit. She lowered the rear ladder and jumped in. I shook my head and smiled. I loved how energetic and curious she always was. She laid face down along the surface of the water, the snorkel sticking up for air. I explored along the top of the rock while she swam around. Then I stopped. There were markings. I knelt for a closer look. These were artificial, symbols of some sort. A language perhaps. It looked almost like runes, ancient Viking writing. I reached down to touch one of the engravings when Hannah poked her head out of the water.
"You have to see this,"
she said. "Hannah, there are markings on this rock."
"There are markings on that side of it as well."
"The side?"
"Yeah, it's like a giant tower.
"What do you mean?"
It's a big cylinder."
"How far does it go down?" Hannah shrugged.
"It's too dark to tell. I think it goes all the way down to the bottom."
I looked back at the rock below my feet. What the hell was this thing? Why hadn't we ever heard of it? Who made these marks? Has everyone else sailed past this giant rock without noticing it?
Come up here,
I said. Hannah swam to the boat and climbed up the ladder.
Those markings look ancient.
She said as she took off the snorkel and goggles and tossed them aside. I knelt back down and rubbed my fingers across one. It began to glow an orangish color.
What the fuck?
I said as I stood back up. Hannah was about to jump onto the rock.
What?
Stay there.
I said, holding my hand up to stop her.
Why?
It's glowing.
What is?
All of a sudden, the rock began to vibrate.
Nate!
Hannah said, panicked.
What's going on?
I began to stumble back towards the boat, fearing the worst. Then, a rectangle opening appeared at the edge of the rock. The vibrating came to a halt. We were both speechless. I hesitated a moment and then approached the opening.
Nate, don't!
Said Hannah.
I just want to look real quick.
I don't like this.
That should have been my first hint, as curious and adventurous as Hannah was. But I couldn't resist at least taking a quick peek. I leaned over the opening and looked inside.
There are stairs,
I said.
Nate, come back.
Against my better judgment, I stepped into the opening. I could see that the stone stairs descended in a wide spiral.
Toss me a flashlight.
I hollered to Hannah.
Nate.
Just do it.
I snapped at her. She huffed and went below deck. I hate that I raised my voice at her. I hardly ever do. But this was too incredible. It could be the most significant discovery in centuries, maybe ever. She returned to the deck and tossed me the light. I turned it on and leaned into the stairwell, trying to see as much as I could. I climbed down a step, not thinking. My curiosity was steering me. Another step.
Nate!
I heard her call my name but continued anyway. Another step.
Nate, stop!
Another step. And then another. And then the rock began to shake again. The opening was beginning to seal shut. I hurried back towards the top. Hannah cried out my name. That was the last time I heard her. It closed before I could get out.
Hannah!
I yelled for her.
Hannah!
No answer.
Touch the center mark!
Still, no response. I stood at the top of the stairs for several minutes, listening for her, for any sign she was trying to get me out, but could not hear anything. I didn't want to leave in case Hannah was able to figure out how to open the door, but my curiosity was still there. I shined the light down the stairs. I took a deep breath and descended. Soon, the darkness faded as the stairwell opened up to a large cylindrical room. Lights flickered from a flame-lit chandelier made of what appeared to be iron. Its design looked medieval or older. In the center of the room was a large wooden podium. A thick leather book lay open atop it. I moved over to it and looked. Somebody had written onto the page symbols like those I'd seen on the rock. I touched the pages, old and worn. I felt like turning a page would cause it to crumble. As if in response to my touch, the writing began to change. The words shifted and faded around the page until they were in English. He waits upon his throne of blood and bone, within the tower of ancient stone. I backed away from the book. My curiosity waned and fear was now coursing through me. I needed to get out. I was confident that what awaited me was something sinister, something evil. I began to feel its presence in the air. Then, as if on cue, it spoke to me. A whisper, like a passing wind, said,
"Come to me."
I did not move, nor could I gather the words to speak. My heart was drumming inside my chest. I glanced over once more. Why hadn't Hannah figured out how to open the door yet? She was no dummy. She saw where I was standing when the rock began to vibrate. She heard me say the mark was glowing, so why was I still trapped inside? Then the thought occurred to me. Maybe the door wouldn't open for her. Maybe going down was my only option. I stepped over to the winding stone stairs and peered down. Hannah had said the tower looked as if it continued to the bottom of the ocean, thousands of feet. I wondered how much of that I would have to walk. How long would it take? And what awaited me below? I took a moment to steady my breath and continued my descent. Down the ancient stone steps of the dark, damp tower, I descended into the unknown. It was quiet. There weren't any sounds to give me a clue as to what would come next. But as I slunk down the steps, I saw that the stairwell was opening up to another large circular room. It did not have an iron chandelier like the room above, but rather a series of lit torches positioned along the wall. And in the center of the room, a man. He was sitting nude in a simple wooden chair. His hair was long and gray with a beard to match. He was bone thin and with skin as pale as the moon. It was as if he hadn't seen the sun in years, maybe ever.
Hello?
I said as I made my way down the steps. He did not answer. I considered proceeding past him, but immediately saw that the remaining stairs were shut off with a large wooden door, with neither knobs nor handles. The only hint I had that the door opened was the keyhole. I glanced over to the man to double check that he had not moved, and then stole a glance through the keyhole. More stairs. I turned my attention back to the man, realizing that if I were to continue any further, he was likely my only hope.
Excuse me.
I inched closer to him. He maintained his forward gaze without moving or speaking. I began to worry that he wasn't even breathing.
Sir?
I said again.
Can you help me?
Still, no response. I leaned next to him.
I need to get out of this tower.
He twisted his head in my direction, and as he did so, I could hear the clicks and pops from his scarcely used joints. He did not look at me so much as faced me, and I soon recognized the cloudy gray of his eyes like those of a blind man. He parted his lips as if to speak, but let out only a dry wheeze. His vocal cords became more dormant and weak over time. Eventually, he was able to utter the words,
He awaits upon the throne of blood and bone, within the tower of ancient stone.
the same lines I had read in the book upstairs.
Who is he?
I asked. The old man did not react, and after a moment, repeated the same lines.
Yes,
I said, growing impatient.
but who is he?
Once again, he repeated the words from the book. I had become frustrated. I raised my voice and finally asked,
How do I get to him then?
The man rose from the chair, shaky and frail, joints popping. He lifted a necklace over his head that his long beard had covered. From the leather string dangled a large iron key. Hunched over, and with great difficulty, the man staggered to the door and inserted the key into the lock. There was an exchange of noises that echoed through the room as he turned the key. The heavy door drifted open on its own, as if some invisible force opened it. The man hung the string back around his neck and receded to his chair. I leaned into the stairwell.
What's down there?
I asked, but the man reverted to his unflinching silence. I readied myself and continued my descent. As I tread further down the stairs, I could see that I was entering into another flame-lit space. The air felt thick and had a copper-like odor. I could hear what sounded like low moaning. I steadied myself against the dark stone wall and felt wetness beneath my hand. I recoiled, and below the flickering light of the overhead torch, I saw that my fingers and palm were red. I gasped. The wall was coated in blood, as if the stones themselves were sweating it. But then I noticed something. There were drops of blood on my skin, on my clothes, and as I touched my clean hand to my face, my fingertips came away smeared with red. There was a lingering mist of blood in the air. My heart began to race. What was this? No single living thing bleeds enough to fill the air. Maybe it isn't blood, I thought. But it smelled like blood, it looked like blood, and as the stairwells opened up to the next room, my fears were confirmed. It was blood. This was not a room like the others. This was a massive chamber, hundreds of feet deep. The stairs spiraled wide and open along the walls, down into a dark pit. Suspended from chains and shackles with their wrists above their heads were 4 people spaced evenly apart. Extending from their slit open and bloodied abdomens were their intestines, stretched to the limit and tied together in a raw, meaty knot. Their legs appeared freshly amputated, and from their gaping wounds, blood flowed.
Dear God,
I said. I'd never seen anything so disturbing, so gruesome, so hellish. Was I in hell? The blood rained down into a dark void that my flashlight could not penetrate. I did not want to continue any further. There could be nothing good awaiting me. These were fresh bodies, fresh victims. I might be next. I decided to turn around, to hurry to the top and hope that Hannah would eventually open the stone hatch. I'd wait all week if I had to. But as I returned to the large wooden door, I saw that it was closed. This side did not have any doors or handles either. I pounded my fist against the door.
let me in!
I yelled. No answer, no movement that I could hear, nothing. I pounded on the door until my arms ached and my hands were sore.
Please!
I began to weep. I should have listened to Hannah. God, what I would have given to be back on the surface with her, holding her, apologizing for being so stubborn, telling her I'd never doubt her again. I wanted that. I needed that. I reluctantly turned from the door and headed back down the steps. I was feeling squeamish and drained of hope. Then I heard it again, a pained moan. I'd forgotten about it earlier when faced with the gruesome sight. I moved down the steps a little more quickly. Who was crying? It sounded like more than one person. I was back out in the open. I focused on the chain nightmare hanging in the center of the chamber, and then I saw it. One of them let out a tormented groan. Then another raised his head, his face contorted in agony. They were alive. I wanted to call out to them, but what good would it do? I couldn't help them, and they weren't in any condition to help me. I averted my gaze, feeling powerless and unsettled, and continued hesitantly down the slick stone steps. I forced the image out of my head and thought of Hannah's tender smile instead.
I will return to you,
I said under my breath. Confidence began to return to me. It warmed my blood and fortified my soul. I was getting out of that tower one way or another. The devil himself couldn't stop me from returning to the woman I love. If I had to, I'd knock down the gates of hell to be with Hannah again. My posture straightened. I clenched my fist and with a newfound eagerness descended into the darkness. And that's when I slipped. I had put my weight down on a particularly slimy part of the stairs, and my foot shot forward, sending me tumbling down the wet stairway. To my right was walled and solid, but to the left was open and a straight drop into the dark. I did not know how far of a fall or what was at the bottom. I bounced and rolled, ramming into the wall and sliding towards the edge. There was nothing to grab a hold of, nothing dry enough for me to even press into. I tried to regain my balance, but I was tumbling too quickly. I was taking a beating, and although I wasn't thinking and trying to survive instead, part of me knew I'd be in rough shape regardless if I lived or died. I picked up quite a bit of momentum when I hit the wall one last time, and did so with enough force that it propelled me backwards and over the edge. My fear had become a reality. I was plummeting to my death, I realized, but the thought was brief. My body splashed into a puddle and landed hard against the solid ground. The air was heaved from my lungs, leaving me wide-eyed and gasping. My body tensed against the wet ground. I lived through the fall, but my breath had escaped, and I was worried that it wouldn't return. Then, as if a seal had been torn away from my mouth, I gulped in a surge of wet, metallic air. I coughed, not sure whether I was choking on my blood or someone else's, or both. The spasms died down and my breathing became steady as I sat up. The throbbing in my ears slowed. I was in pitch black. I knew I was sitting in an almost ankle-high puddle of what was undoubtedly blood. I could hear the dripping that came from the mutilated bodies overhead, but there was another noise, heavier, sloshing in the puddle and occasionally patter, and then more sloshing. Finally, a potent splash sent a spray of droplets in my direction. Something was in there with me. I waded through the blood, a blind and desperate search for my flashlight. Where was it? Could it be on the stairs? My fingers brushed against a solid object. I gripped it and spun around. I clicked it on towards the noise. The blood-soaked lens bathed them in red light. Drenched head to toe were 3 women dancing beneath a shower of blood, stirring up waves in the gore around them. They moved with ecstasy, tossing their crimsoned hair back to let the blood wash over their faces. They were unfazed by my light, entranced in the moment like a group possessed. The fuck was happening? I aimed the light around the room, looking for a door. There wasn't one. Solid wall all the way around. I wondered if this was the bottom. But then I noticed something. The blood was moving along my ankles, draining, slowly. I shined the light on it and realized it was moving like how you might see in a bathtub or a sink, to the center, between the sanguine dancers. I stepped towards them, tracing the slow-moving current of the blood. At their feet, I saw what looked like a sewer lid. It had some holes that the blood was draining through, holes that I could use to stick my fingers through and lift the lid. I held my breath and slid between the dancing women. Suddenly, their dance changed. They linked hands and encircled me. They began to let out a bone-chilling laugh as they skipped around me, counterclockwise like children playing Ring Around the Rosie. I lifted the heavy lid and pushed it aside, anxious to leave the frightening scene behind. There was a ladder. I stepped down, the women still snickering around in circles. The ladder was, of course, very slippery from all the blood that seeped down. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it into the dark below. Nothing. I began to descend and all of a sudden lost my footing. My heart skipped a beat and I hooked my arm onto the ladder at the last second, dropping the flashlight in the process. It rattled off a metal rung and I watched as it fell, becoming a distant speck swallowed by the dark. I had a long way to go. To descend a ladder into utter darkness, one must move tedious and measuredly. A single wrong step might have caused me to plunge deep into further blackness. I did not know what awaited me at the bottom. There was no way for me to find out exactly how much time had passed, but I could feel that it had been hours. My slow descent was reduced even further by soreness and fatigue. My body ached all over. There was an odor, the copper-like smell of blood mixed with a rotting putridity. It had been present throughout my climb down the ladder. It gnawed at my head and made focusing difficult. Blood rained past me from above. How did they bleed so much? I heard the dripping of liquid joining more liquid. My body was ready to give out when I felt the legs submerge into something warm and wet. Water would have been a welcome change, but I knew better. More blood. I hesitated a moment. I still lacked all visibility. I would be treading blindly through the blood. I peered up the ladder, but the manhole cover had been resealed hours ago. I took a deep breath and stepped off the ladder. My feet were unable to reach the bottom of the blood-filled pool. I kicked and paddled with great effort to keep my head above the gore. Blood is thicker than water. I knew that my best bet was to stay against the wall and follow it, and hope that it would lead me to a door or some other way out. I pressed my hand against the slimy stone and swam. I hadn't got far when I saw a lantern flicker to life at the opposite end of the chamber. In its faint glow, I could see a wooden rowboat. The blood rippled as the oars were pushed and pulled, propelling the boat towards me.
Hello?
I called out. The boat continued in my direction. I was hesitant to find out who was steering, but what choice did I have? The boat reached me, and I could see a shadowy figure on board. He wore a dark, ragged coat with the hood over his head. Shadows concealed his face. He leaned towards me and extended his arms.
"Take my hand,"
he said. His voice was aged but still had some strength to it. I was slick with blood. I would not be easy to grip. I did as he had said, and to my surprise, he grabbed a hold of my hand and hauled me out of the blood into the boat. I was a crimson sheen under the glimmer of the lantern. The man grabbed the lantern and sat in front of me. He set the lantern down between us and lowered his hood. He had long, unwashed white hair and a long beard. Like the man who had opened the door for me earlier, he was elderly, but not as skeletal as the other man. I could see that he was missing his right eye.
Thank you.
I said. The older man nodded.
What is this tower?
I asked.
"A prison, mostly. This chamber is my cell."
How long have you been down here?
"I do not know.
Why are you here?
I was captured."
The old man smirked and grabbed a hold of the oars and began to row us back to the side he'd came from.
Have you tried to escape?
The old man exhaled.
"There is no use. We've been deprived of that which gives us our strength."
We?
"My people, my family, they are imprisoned here as well."
I thought back to the 4 tortured souls above. Their intestines pulled from their bodies and blood pouring from their amputated legs.
Are you aware of the cruelty that is taking place above?
The old man nodded.
"This pool of blood is theirs."
How many people have bled to fill a pool this deep?
The old man stopped rowing. We had reached the other side.
"The 4 men you saw hanging have always been, ever since we've been here. They are mutilated, hung from chains, and when their bodies run dry, they are brought down and healed. Then, the cycle repeats."
Healed by who? The 3 women?
The old man nodded.
Yerd, Verdandi, and Skuld, they shape destiny. That of the 4 men above has become a circle of blood and agony.
Those names sound Nordic.
I suddenly remembered the symbols I'd seen on the surface of the tower. They had looked like Viking runes. The old man produced a weary smile.
"Yes."
He took hold of the lantern and rose to his feet. He stepped off the boat onto a stone platform and held out his hand for me to follow. Next to the platform was another large wooden door. This one was solid, no keyhole.
"I am not able to open this door, but you are,"
said the old man.
Why me?
"He calls for you."
What does he want?
"I do not know."
Who is he?
The prophets spoke of him as if he were the coming days of oblivion. We were ignorant of the truth, that he lives and breathes.
I don't understand.
"You will."
The old man motioned at the door.
"Place your hands upon the door and it will open."
I did as he told me. There was a sequence of clicks and thumps as the door unlocked, and then slowly but surely, it drifted open. A breath of wind swept against me, and the whispering breath of the one who waits again said,
Come to me.
I turned to the old man.
The door is open. You can join me.
The old man shook his head.
"I'm sorry. It is too great a risk. But perhaps you can help us."
How?
"Find Aiden. She holds the key.
The key to what?
To ending this."
I looked back at the open door and the descending stone stairs beyond. The old man placed a hand on my shoulder and said,
"My sons are down there. I have not seen them in a very long time.
What are their names?
The old man had removed his hand from my shoulder and was returning to the rowboat.
I recognize you.
He said.
We've never met before.
The old man took a seat in the boat and raised his hood back over his head. Another round of blood began to flow down the ladder and into the pool. The dripping echoed off the chamber walls. The old man glanced toward the sound. He looked back at me and smiled.
Not as you are, but as you once were.
The old man extinguished the lantern's flame, casting behind him a curtain of darkness.
What does that mean?
I asked. I could hear the movement of oars and the stirring of the blood. I asked once more, but the man did not respond. I stood at the door and peered down the long, winding stairwell. I could hear what sounded like the distant clang of a hammer striking metal, and towards it I went. Thank you all again for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Be sure to come back next week for part 2. I'll have another guest voice with me. Another huge shout out to RomNex, As the Raven Dreams, and SomberPuppet. Thank you all so much for joining me on this journey. And thank you, FishermanTales, for allowing me to read the story. It is freaking fantastic. But until next time, remember, just because you couldn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't watching you.